Hey, this is David Rovix with another episode of Discussions with David, which, as always, well, it's just coming to you at a slightly different time than usual, but as always, you can find archived at youtube.com/drovix and in podcast form if you look for This Week with David Rovix, wherever you get your podcasts. And I'm very happy to have with me John Lasdun, who is one of the folks involved with the Working Class History Project, which is an absolutely amazing project, which I've been deeply impressed by for quite a long time since my friend Paula, historian in Australia, turned me on to it. And we've got John with me now. But John, I mean, people who have been to the website workingclasshistory.com or seen working class history on any number of different platforms. I mean, I know that there's a lot more people out there, who have seen all of this stuff than are listening to this broadcast, because you have a tremendous a number of followers on many different platforms doing amazingly wonderful popular education. And I know Americans are apt to use a lot of adjectives, but I'm just wildly impressed by both the content of what you're doing with this work and also the reach. And I want to talk about all of that, but I won't try to talk about everything at once. But can I just hello, how did you get into history in the first place? As a you came at it from a radical as a radical first, and then got into history later, or was the history did the history come before the radicalism?
Well, firstly, just to say hi, well, thanks, thanks very much for that, and thanks for having me. Yeah, we're fans of yours as well. So thanks for all the great work, and we've used some of your music in our podcast as well, which we're grateful for. Especially given the Creative Commons nature of your work, it's much appreciated. In in particular, we used your song about the name has just escaped me, about opposition to the Vietnam War,
Hmm.
song.
Song for Hugh Thompson, was it, or no?
No, something March.
They
Oh
could.
damn it!
They were. Oh,
But
geez. Oh, well, I'll
oh,
have to look it up.
but
I've
no, it
written a
wasn't that
few.
one. And well, some of the lines were like, something ROTC offices go up in recruitment offices go up in flames, and things. I can't remember the name of it, but it's great anyway. So thanks for that.
Excellent.
Um,
Yes. And
the
your
name's
website is divided
Yep.
up according to months. I mean, this is when I was looking at the way the book is divided up, and so many of the stuff on the different platforms you have divided up by month. It's sort of giving me flashbacks, because I didn't know anybody else who was dividing up working class history according to months and listing events that had taken place and doing this history of like what happened over the today in history. And I mean, the feed is just amazing, and so many people are following it. But I'm getting ahead of myself again.
Yeah. Oh, so your question was
I'm
history.
asking too many questions at once. But how did you get into it in the first
Yeah.
place as an individual?
So, um, it's a bit convoluted, I'm afraid.
Good.
Um,
We got an hour.
but essentially, yeah, it was through becoming involved in I don't know, I don't really call it like politics or activism, and I hate both of those terms. So I'm not really want to not really sure what to call it
Yeah,
exactly, but
these terms are
essentially.
troubling.
Yeah, because because politics is often spoken about, about government, about elections, and blah blah blah, which is not what we're about, obviously. And also, activism is kind of like a specialist activity, that people identify as activists and they do activism, and that's not really what it is either. It's um, well, it can be, but that's not great. What's important is just like ordinary people, us just doing what we can to like take back power and improve our own lives together collectively. If there was just a simple easy word for that, that'd be great. And then these kind of terms and everything, but that's kind of
Yeah.
good. Yeah, so anyway, history, in school I was not a fan of it. I dropped in the UK. We start specializing very early. It's not kind of like the US or even when
Hmm.
you go to university you study everything. We start specializing at the age of like 11, 12, I think. And so, I dropped history as a subject as quickly as I could.
And specializing, like, when is it like in Germany where you start specializing? Like they kind of put one, like you're either on a college track or a vocational track at that age. Is it that kind of specializing?
No, no, not exactly. No, no, no. I mean, I'd say no, not in general terms. No, you just basically start eliminating subjects.
Okay,
And
and you
so
eliminate like that history at that early
yeah,
age.
that
That is,
yeah, that's
okay.
that because that's like a humanity. So you can drop those quite. You can't drop all of them. You have to do some of them until 16. But I chose geography instead of
Mm.
history personally, so I could learn about Oxbow Lakes and Oxbow Lake near Uganda as of learning about
Right.
development. So every country starts off poor and then it develops really quick and then everyone's rich and it's great. And that's just what happens. And all the countries in the developed world are just stuck at the early stage because of time. And as soon as time passes, then it will develop and then it will get wealthy. There's nothing to do with colonialism or neo-colonialism, resource plundering, anything like that. It's
They're
just
always
time.
somehow in a constant state of development.
Exactly. And, they just have to be patient and wait. And then they'll all have, PlayStation 5s and jacuzzis soon enough. Anyway, so this is I need to be a bit briefer. So anyway, yeah, dropped it
No.
in school, didn't give a sugar. Am I allowed
Hmm.
to say swear words?
Yeah, we're not on the radio. Although this could be broadcast on the radio, so ideal not to swear, but it's okay.
Okay, I will do my best. I am British, so it's very hard not to swear all the
Bollocks.
time.
You could say bollocks. That's okay.
Okay, just use British words that
Yeah, use
kind
British
of
swear words.
US people won't
Bloody
know
bollocks.
a
Yeah,
swear
that's
word. Yeah. Okay, that's
yeah.
good to know. So, basically, got interested in history through getting involved in social movements and stuff. So, as for me, the anti-capitalist movement of the early 2000s, sometimes called the anti-globalization movement, was the thing which kind of I think contributed to my sort of political ideas. And I'd say that I was part of that generation who was radicalized by that movement. And I'd always been in subjects like the environment, protecting the environment, and opposing the Israeli occupation of Palestine and things like that. But then I think with the anti-capitalist movement, that kind of learning about capitalism and how that's the cause of kind of a lot of these problems was really helpful. And then just I do stuff like organize stuff at work. I was very active in trying to organize at work with my colleagues and doing things like social movement and activisty stuff outside of work, and just doing that at the same time was kind of reading quite voraciously. And I found that on a personal level, reading books of theory or whatever didn't really appeal to me. I didn't really get anything out of them. I found them generally quite tedious. And no, that's not to say it's a bad thing. If people want to do that, go for it. Just on a personal level, I didn't find it particularly helpful or interesting or relevant. But what I did find, so things like in terms of anarchist classic texts or whatever, like not to be sort of sacrilegious or anything, but reading stuff like Kropotkin's Conquest of Bread or whatever, didn't find super interesting. I do apologize for any Bread Santa fans out there. And I know on YouTube especially, he's got and obviously
Of course. He's
not
got his following, but you
yeah,
discovered storytelling. You did the history in the form of stories, and
well, exactly. And
yeah,
Kropotkin's Memoirs of a Revolutionist, different kettle of fish,
whole
and
different
so
thing, right? Yeah,
and so reading memoirs and historical things, I found spoke to me kind of much more, and
yeah.
I found that stuff was much more useful in terms of drawing lessons about how we can organize and how we can win and what's gone wrong in the past.
Right.
So that on one side, and on the other side, just learning about all the incredible stories of resistance and stuff on the other hand, that I found really inspiring, and all these incredible people that I was reading about that just did really everyday people that did absolutely amazing stuff that I'd never heard of. Just just kind of small stories like Georg Elser, there was a German carpenter who I hadn't heard about, but tried to blow up Hitler during World War II, just kind of on his own.
Freelance, excellent.
and unfortunately failed. Not that that's an endorsement of violence, of course, in any way. This is purely for educational purposes. But and stories like that, and also at the same time learning about just the kind of everyday atrocities of capitalism and colonialism, which are history is replete with, but most people aren't that aware of, really, how much kind of blood there is over everything that we have. Over things like the weekend or that 8-hour working day, and all that, the people that kind of died for that sort of thing. So that's kind of what the long way of saying how I got interested in history and old stuff.
Because it had so much to teach us about what had gone on before, and it's such a powerful way to talk about what's happening now in the forms anecdotes that people can actually relate to and not glaze over from reading theory, which is not, you're not the only one who has that experience from reading theory. I'm quite certain.
And that's not to say that it's for everyone. Different people, some people prefer to write or read news and analysis and that sort of things, and some people prefer theory, and there's a space for all of that. That's just not where my interest is, and that's not what I'm good at doing or whatever. So I kind of thought, after a while of trying different things, sort of settled on this. It's like, well, interested in this, and seem to be able to contribute in a meaningful way with this work.
And how did this project come together then? How what you're doing is basically, I would describe it as popular education, or that would be certainly one of the most common terms to use to describe, I guess, what you're doing, and what I've been trying to do in different forms. But you have, how did this start, and what platforms were you on originally? Because you just seem to have a really wonderful, really well worked out presence on a variety of platforms. And for people who are active online today, which is of course most people in one form or another, all these platforms, they're not all the same. They all have their own idiosyncrasies, and what you're doing, what you guys are doing on Instagram, on YouTube, on Facebook is, it seems to me, really using these, and Patreon as well. You're using these platforms all really well, which is not necessarily what you see happening all the time. And then the website is fantastic, and a new book on PM Press, incidentally, which is just out in last December, I believe.
Yes.
And the book is a fantastic curated version of what you have on the other platforms, to make it fit in a book size thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it includes some stuff that hasn't been on social media or whatever, because the social media stuff kind of needs photos with it, and some of these events don't have photos. So,
and where that's another thing. And I know I'm asking too many questions at once, but there we go. Where do all these photos come from? Because that's one of the most notable things about the Instagram account. And I assume, I don't know why you have so many thousands of people looking at every post. It has a problem, given that the medium. I assume it has to do with the photos, and not just the wonderful stories that are also accompanying each photo. But these photos are wonderful, or drawings in some cases.
Yeah, because obviously some events don't have specific photos that go along with them. So one thing that we want to do more in future is get illustrations of some of these things that photos don't exist for. But you know, as for where do we find places, you know, a bit everywhere. You know, we just spend a lot of time looking for things, and I mean, Google image search obviously is great, and then also reverse Google image search is really important as well for checking things, because unfortunately a lot of photos are misattributed. You know, online photos, especially if historical stuff, is misattributed and has like the wrong names of people and events and things like that. So yeah, reverse, even if we find an image from somewhere else, putting it through reverse image search is important, just to you know, try and figure out if it is what it's supposed to be of or not. And
And
before
what
you ask
about
that question,
copyright
sorry.
issues? Was I, what, at the scale you're operating on, you must have to deal with that, right? I mean, because otherwise you're going to get sued by Getty Images or something. Is that not an issue,
Uh, well, yeah, I mean,
or
it
is that a
is.
bad question? Should we avoid that one? Let's just skip that question then. Okay.
I, we, the, we, yeah, we make every effort to ensure that we have requisite copyright permissions to use images
Right.
that we do. I mean, there is a big problem generally with these big photo houses like Alamy and Getty, and some, you know, that some of the behaviour they engage in is pretty reprehensible. So
Yeah.
you know, they do things like they'll, you know, sometimes they won't even buy the rights to photos. They'll just find historical photos, they'll scan it, and then they'll claim that they're the copyright holder and charge
Mm.
people for using it, even though they're not. You know, there's been examples of them suing photographers for using their own work, which Getty or Alamy or whichever company is. I can't think of the specific company name this lawsuit was about, so don't think this is a specific one. You know, any kind of, so this isn't a legally binding kind of claim or anything, but some of these photo houses have even sued photographers for using their own work. And I actually even saw the other day a Twitter account I follow called Spanish Civil War, run by a guy called Nick Lloyd, tweeted a photograph. It's kind of a well-known photograph for kind of leftists or anarchists in particular from the Spanish Civil War, of a woman in Barcelona with her fist raised in front of a flag that has CNT-FAI on it.
Mm.
Which was an anarchist group and union in Spain at the time. And I mean, I imagine you probably have seen the photo, but that's a photo where the kind of good quality original one had been lost, but I saw that Alamy was claiming it was theirs and selling rights to it, whereas the original photo was taken by a Spanish photographer whose name I can't remember, but it was found in a briefcase just a couple of weeks ago. So there is no way that Alamy had the rights anyway. So there are, yeah. So yes, copyright is an unfortunate. Is an unfortunate thing with historical imagery and knowledge, that it's in the hands of these big companies.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's a big question, but it just seems like with publishing anything in any forum, like, I mean, when I'm just looking for images to use for different things I'm putting up, I mean, of course, if you want to look for things that are only, you know, not copyrighted, then you're not going to find images for the vast majority of things you're looking for, at least from my experience, right? And I don't know. And when putting out podcasts, and if I'm often just using my own music because I don't know how to deal with the complexities of using copyrighted music and then dealing with stuff getting taken down. But you know, I don't know. Yeah, it's talk to an entertainment lawyer about that stuff.
Yeah, no, it's a real minefield. So that's why it was, you know, we really appreciate your work being Creative Commons, and also all of our work is Creative Commons as well, and people are free to reuse it with attribution.
How did you and speaking of minefields, though, coming to the decision to do that, was that itself a minefield for you, or was that an easy one?
You mean doing WCH social media stuff,
No,
or?
doing making it all Creative Commons?
Oh no, not at all. That was just like, you know, that was I think for, yeah, I think everything that I've kind of been involved in, particularly writing wise, is always just like, well, copyright is literally, it's private property, and and private property of knowledge and information. So for people, if people want to abolish private property, then at the very least, we should, ideas and information shouldn't be private property. Yeah, no, like kind of everything that I've been involved in has always been, Creative Commons, that people, because information should be free. Yeah.
And since you mentioned social media, though, that's a point that I'm sure somebody is out there is wondering. I mean, then your use of so many different social media platforms. I mean, I guess I would answer my own question. It's kind of obvious. It's like everybody's on Facebook, so of course, if you're going to communicate with people, you're going to use Facebook. But how do you do you have to cope with the algorithms and the morality of the different platforms in any way in particular?
I'd say morality, no. I think if if everything is immoral, everything is immoral to some. Like electricity is, immoral. Kind of everything is immoral to some extent. So but with the forms, they've got their, we do have to take about things, which, especially for Twitter, we don't worry about, because it's not so algorithmically driven. But with Instagram and Facebook nowadays isn't so much either. I think just because there's so much stuff on Facebook that it's pretty much the same for everyone. There are so many pages, and also the amount of time people spend on Facebook has massively dwindled over the past few years. Kind of initially from people's parents joining it, which is kind of
that's what I hear was the big effect when I talk to people about like why they're not using Facebook. That's what they say. What my parents got on Facebook, so I had to get somewhere else. But how do you approach the different platforms? That's a great question, and so, in terms of how your kind of strategy.
Yeah, so I mean, we started on Facebook because when we started in 2014, it was kind of the main game in town. I mean, there was Twitter, obviously, but Twitter's always been much smaller. And also its character limit is 100. Well, back then it was 140 characters. Now it's a bit better, 280, but still, it's still
hard
not
to tell much of a story from working class history
exactly.
in 280 characters.
Exactly. Like, and even when we do posts on, Instagram or Facebook with longer characters, people still comment and been like, well, there's a lot of nuance and background missing here. You haven't, like, things like talking about the Soviet Union recriminalizing homosexuality or whatever and throwing gay people into gulags, and people with sort of Stalin, what do you call them, avatars, kind of say like, well, you haven't really talked about the context here, and it's like, well, I mean, you can put that into context. It doesn't make it any better. But even if you want kind of context and nuance and stuff, like read a book, don't look at social media. Obviously, we do, but that's a minor gripe. But obviously, yeah, I mean, Twitter is, the character limit makes it very difficult to tell any kind of story. So yeah, Facebook is what we started on because, especially back in 2014, it was, very big, very popular. Lots of people were using it, and we thought there wasn't really anyone else doing something like we wanted to do, which is kind of why we thought that we would start doing it. So and then obviously more recently, thankfully, we got enough supporters on Patreon that we could set up some kind of get some social media tools to help us update different multiple accounts kind of remotely and automate some of it, which meant that we were able to start an Instagram account, which has been very fortunate. I think we managed to, I think it was a year and a half, 2 years ago, we managed to start the Instagram account, and which is very fortunate because since then Facebook has had a huge decline, particularly in the wake of the Cambridge Analytica scandal and the fact that it got Donald Trump elected, and basically tearing apart society at the seams, but contributing to that. Yeah, so it was kind of, so yeah, in terms of the algorithms, Instagram in particular is one where you have to be more wary. So which is kind of unfortunate in a way, because if you post stuff which isn't that popular, then it makes anything else you post less popular as well. So that is a shame in terms of history stuff, because it means that you post stuff about the places where we have more readers, like the US, it gets more feedback and then it gets seen by more people. Whereas you post stuff about places where there's fewer people who really live there, like Guyana or Zanzibar or Indonesia or something, and it generally gets less response. And so that was kind of why that was one of the things that was good about doing the book, that it meant that we could take a much more broader kind of view, and have a much more kind of broader selection of stuff without having to worry about getting kind of our content getting killed by the algorithm for not being quite popular enough.
That's interesting. And then have you, since putting out the book, I know it's only been out for a few months now, but have you found that you're, I mean, probably it's this crazy question because it's probably too soon to even be able to tell, but do you find that putting out the book is getting more attention to any different historical anecdotes that don't get as much attention on Instagram because it's not about the US or something?
Couldn't really tell, really. And I think, in the book there's over kind of 700 stories, so like short, just like very short kind of, I don't know if you call them stories, but snippets or whatever. So no, we couldn't really tell.
And then trying to put together such collections myself, I mean, in my own efforts, it's been relatively easy because I've only been putting together collections of stories that I've already written songs about. So that kind of like, narrows it down. But
you have written a lot of songs.
a few hundred, but not 700, only 400. So how did you, I mean, and there's way more than 700 exciting historical anecdotes, each one of which could make an amazing movie, or or a book or any number of other things, or song. I mean, there's so much, but how did you boil the book down to 700 anecdotes? What kind of a process was that?
Yeah, so basically, we've got an archive of historical events that we've kind of written up over the years, which has got about 4,000. It's got about 4,000 stories in it at the moment, and it's constantly growing. So we basically, sorted it in date order, went through to choose 2 a day. So we just went through it a couple of times and narrowed it down to the best 2 or 3 each day, and then we went through it again and we're like, oh, hold on, there's too many stories here about about, say, a partisan resistance in World War II, so let's drop some of those, and some might have overlapped, the beginning and the end of a strike, so we just thought, let's combine them into one. So yeah, it was just kind of going through it all a few times and trying to pick out the most different, so we had the biggest variation of content in the book, to keep it as diverse and interesting, basically, as possible. And obviously it's not represented, it's not fully representative of the the depth of kind of social movements and that have happened in the world, but we wanted it to be as good as possible given the content that we have so far.
One of the this is maybe getting really geeky here, but like one of the bizarre things that you come across when you're trying to collect history and connect it to dates is that there's more things that happen on some months than other months. Do you think? Is that your
Definitely. Well, summer.
right?
Summer is more, or when it's more stuff happens in summer, and there's more riots in summer.
Yeah.
Like that
and
is,
rebellions and all sorts of things. I mean, even like military campaigns often just like take a vacation for the winter because nobody can move. Like, I mean, historically, right? So like,
yeah,
there's yeah,
yeah. And although some people still try and invade Russia, you know, um,
they keep trying that over so
and
many
then
times.
they forget, and then winter comes, and it's like,
Oh
really,
shit!
really, people
Yeah,
should learn by now, but people don't. Um, but yeah, no, it is funny how some days are quite lacking in stuff, and then other day other days it's just like, wow, holy shit, there's so much stuff on there. Oh, holy sugar,
absolutely.
sorry.
Oh, it's
That
okay. I just messed up already and swore. So
there's yeah, and some days have loads. I think that the one day we were most glad to get some stuff for was February the 29th.
oh, excellent. What happened? Do you remember offhand on February the
Oh yeah, so
29th?
February 29th. So I know definitely, like, there was yeah, Hattie McDaniel, who was a black actor from the US who won an Oscar, and was but the Oscars venue was segregated, and so wasn't was forbidden from sitting alongside everyone else. So there's that. There's Collar Laundry Union in Troy, New York, in 1864, I believe. They won their strike on the 29th of on February the 29th, at yeah, a kind of really pioneering union of women in the US. So those are a couple of February 29 things. Um,
Excellent.
off the top of my head.
I love it. And in the introduction to the book and on the website, and I mean, one of the themes I think on in the first paragraph you mentioned is the way history is basically a collection of stories that represent the struggle between the haves and the have-nots in one form or another. Like this, I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, but the this sort of the history being a phenomenon that is basically uh, caused by this ongoing struggle between those who control everything and those who are trying to eke out a little corner of existence for themselves within an unequal society. I mean, it's such a overriding theme to the whole thing, I guess. But I wonder if there's like particular. I mean, you're with this book and with everything you're doing, you're getting such a broad perspective. And I don't know where I'm going with this question, but like, are there sort of broad kind of themes that you're noticing as you're putting together the book that are maybe I don't know which kinds of broad themes kind of come to mind as you're putting these things together? It's way
Sorry,
too much of a broad question. Broad
broad
themes of
themes
is
in
like
what
yeah, like
context? Sorry.
yeah, like the uh, as your uh, is I guess what different forms are you looking at in terms of the struggle between the haves and the have-nots that you would like as sort of major themes? And is that that's way too broad a question, isn't it? Really?
I mean, it's quite a broad question. I'm not really sure how I would answer. I mean, I mean, if you mean, we've got, yeah, I'm not really
Like
sure how to.
it's not all the I guess what I'm trying to get at is the term working class history.
Mhm.
It's class is only the perhaps the overriding kind of division in society that we can say certainly goes back thousands of years. But within that sort of basic sort of broad concept of working class, there's so many different sort of divides within society, and I'm just wondering if you can sort of paint a picture of any of the
Mhm.
Whatever comes to mind when I say that, basically, because I know
Yeah.
people probably wonder like why working class history as opposed to characterizing it in some other way, that characterizing this conflict in some other way.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think how to how to answer that question. Um, but yeah, I mean, I suppose there are uh, all all kinds of divisions within our class. For things like from very basic things like to do with work, like things like we're divided into employed and unemployed. So that those of us that have jobs have to be in kind of constant fear of those essentially being let go and being replaced by the what's sometimes referred to as the reserve army of the unemployed. Um, you know, different enterprises, different companies, corporations compete with each other, um, and so that that's another way that we're divided, which is super effective, because that can kind of ensure, capitalism kind of builds in its own defense mechanism, so say if you have like um, uh, an automaker where its workers win really great paying conditions, then the company will make less profit, so it will go out of business, and then be overtaken by it will either go out of business or be taken over by a competitor that pays its workers and stuff less.
Mm.
There's that. There's obviously uh, um, in our again, like with work, a lot of stuff that is a lot of work which is seen as stereotypically women's work isn't even considered as paid work, particularly things like reproductive labor, caring labor, and housework and things like that is often just isn't even deemed of being worthy of pay,
Right.
um, and obviously
The
racial and ethnic divisions,
mm-hmm.
whereby certain in a given country or what have you, certain racial or ethnic groups are systematically or systemically, depending on the structure, disadvantaged and oppressed, in specific ways, for multiple reasons. An obviously prominent example being the situation of black people in the United States, firstly by slavery, and then after the Civil War, through all kinds of other, after the premature end of, well, not that
Yeah.
Reconstruction ended, after Reconstruction was ended, all the kind of ways that they white racist authorities tried to kind of reinstitute slavery by other means,
Mm-hmm.
things like black codes and things like that, which required all black people to work for a white employer and forbid them from changing jobs and that sort of thing. And then anyone who breached those laws could essentially be put in prison and then enslaved again legally under the Constitution, which obviously kind of famously today still does permit slavery, as long as it's punishment for a crime.
Mm-hmm.
No matter that what is considered a crime is so all these. Um, so I mean, these
Yeah.
are all kinds of different ways that, and obviously, that all that stuff kind of continues up to the present day through Jim
Right.
Crow and and even then, and post Jim Crow was kind of legal segregation, but then after that, there's de facto segregation. It's not segregation, specifically because of race, but it essentially, taking like schools as an example, New York City hasn't had Jim Crow. Wasn't a Jim Crow place, but its schools were the most segregated by race in the country, because of how the public schooling system is set up and how geographical areas are where kids can come from and how kids are selected for schools and things. So all these things continue up to the present day, and
Yep.
and obviously struggles against them continue as well. Yeah, sorry, I
And
don't know
John,
if that answers your
speaking,
question.
no,
Yeah.
that's excellent. That's a great answer to a very badly phrased question. But can you, speaking of the present day, John, when we're, I mean, I think history is being talked about more on National Public Radio and BBC and many other networks. Although I'd probably say those are the two, maybe Al Jazeera. I mean, it's basically history is being talked about more over the past year than it generally gets talked about. I'd say because the history of white supremacy, the history of pandemics. There's a lot of history that's being dredged up by many different events in 2020. And as 2020 is going, and I'm paying attention to mass media of various kinds, as well as wonderful more alternative, I guess we could say, sources of information like what you're putting out. I mean, there are serious issues with, I think, how the media is covering history, and I wonder if, I don't know how much consumption of corporate and so-called public media you do in your day-to-day life, but to the whatever extent you're doing that, I wonder if you have any thoughts on how history is being covered as opposed to how you would rather it be covered.
Yeah, I do read and watch and listen to a lot of news. I think I'd get more done if I didn't.
Yeah.
And might be, but I don't know, like especially recently. I think for a while I sort of fell out of it, but I don't know that recently there's been so much news and so much has been so interesting that, yeah, unfortunately, I've been kind of glued to it, and that has been really interesting to see recently. Things like the history of colonialism and stuff like that has really kind of blown into the public sphere, and a lot of that is due to due to kind of rank and file activism by self-organized and led by people of color and lots of people in the global south, and which to highlight this and expose the history, and that's which is fantastic. So yeah, it has been good to see those kind of questions be talked about, because especially for people on like the right or whatever, they don't really have much of an answer to any of this stuff. That I think the only way of dealing with all this stuff for a while has just been kind of brushing it under the carpet. Because so much terrible stuff has been done in the names of Britain or the United States or what have you, in terms of genocide, slavery, whatever kind of crimes you can think of. But when it does come up, yeah, the right doesn't really have much of a, they don't say, oh well, actually, they can't really do things to justify the genocide of Native Americans, say, or any of the other genocides of indigenous peoples in other places. It's more just kind of just try and brush stuff under the carpet, and brush stuff up the carpet, and then accuse other people of trying to airbrush or erase history or something. And it's like, well, no, that's the exact opposite of what's happening. Is now people are saying, well, we need to talk about this. We need to talk about this history and deal with it, and not just brush it under the carpet or erase it or rewrite it, which is what has been done up to this point, where people have said, oh, so Christopher Columbus in 1492 or whatever sailed the ocean blue and something, and then turned up in the Caribbean and started, I mean, enslaving and murdering everyone that he came across. It's sorry, that's my cat.
Hello, cat. Cat can be on the podcast too.
Yeah. So I can't
So
remember where I was going with
being
that answer,
covered.
but yeah,
like...
but it's good that this has
Mhm.
been talking a bit. But yeah, you know, it's good that this is being talked about, and I think, you know, it's also good that there's been, you know, there is so much interest in elements of this history from
Mm.
from uh, kind of, I wouldn't say forgotten perspectives, but deliberately erased perspectives, you know, of oppressed people and indigenous peoples and women and working class people, and you know, yeah.
Yeah, definitely, right. And do you get the impression there are certain aspects of the horrors of history that are now being talked about more than other aspects? I mean, I don't want to ask a ridiculously leading question, so just to say where I'm going with this is my impression is that so many of the worst aspects of the U.S. History of institutional racism, for example, are being dredged up, and as they most definitely should be in every detail. But what's not often being dredged up is the history of resistance. Like, the KKK's domination of the South is being talked about a lot, and and it sure should. And what happened in the pogroms, the massacre in Tulsa, and so many other things that everybody should know about these things. But the fact that the IWW organized campaigns of resistance against the KKK, nobody's talking about that. Nobody's hearing about that. It's never mentioned on NPR. If they ever have said anything about the IWW's existence on NPR, it was when I was asleep.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that is, you know, stories of resistance, I think, are often written out and are not written about, especially when they, you know, step beyond the bounds of what the kind of, whatever you want to call the media, the mainstream media or the liberal media, or, you know, whatever deem acceptable, which is kind of essentially non-violent protest or lobbying, and so and you know, so that stuff is generally hasn't been spoken about that much. And you know, in the United States, I think the good example is, I think people still talk a lot about the Civil War and its role in ending of slavery, you know, which is true, and that there is that strong connection there, obviously. But there's also been, you know, centuries of uprisings of enslaved people across the Americas, obviously, in the United States, but also in Latin America and the Caribbean, most famously, obviously, in Haiti, which was where there was a successful revolution against slavery and French colonialism, which Haiti is still being made to pay for today.
Which is one of the most powerful historical anecdotes I think that anybody could ever bring up, is the fact that Haiti had to pay reparations to France for how long after the Haitian Revolution? Like over 100
I
years.
Believe 2015 it was technically when it was paid off. But you know, in a similar on a similar line, the UK government, or the British government, as it was then, when it's the date generally given for the British Empire abolishing slavery was 1833, I believe, although that's not technically true. That's when it was when it was originally largely abolished just in the British Caribbean, albeit that enslaved people would still have to work for their former enslavers for a period of 4 more years. but also the enslavers were compensated by the British taxpayer for the loss of their quote property, and that is a debt which the British government only finished paying off. I can't remember the exact year, but it's in the last few years, and that huge injection of public capital actually gave a lot of these enslavers the capital to actually be able to start businesses, industrial businesses. So this kind of injection of capital actually kind of helped jumpstart the Industrial Revolution and industrial capitalism in Britain. And I think this is something which even a lot of people that call themselves Marxists or anarchists or whatever kind of forget about, is they see kind of capitalism as superseding pre-capitalist forms of like slavery and things like that. And it's like, well, you know, it did sort of come later, but you know, the birth of capitalism was very much still predicated and based on the exploitation of enslaved people. You know, so that was in Britain, and obviously in the States, the Industrial Revolution here was powered by textiles, which were still picked from cotton picked by enslaved people in the South. So again, you know, capitalism in the northeastern United States was still based on the exploitation of enslaved people in the South. But we were talking about and resistance. So obviously, and all of these, and again, you know, similarly in the UK, people talk about the abolition of slavery, and people talk about famous abolitionists in the British Parliament, but not many people talk about all the rebellions of enslaved people across the British Caribbean.
No, those are the stories they want us to hear about, right? It's the parliamentary opposition and the official wars, right? Not the Frederick Douglasses or the John Browns or the more sort of grassroots kind of stuff. Is that
and not the people who decided to not to take it on turn the other cheek or whatever, but to kill their enslavers and burn their plantations to the ground, and similarly with similarly with other movements like the suffragettes who with the right to vote in Britain. People talk about their hunger strikes and things like that, but don't talk about the window smashing and the street fights with police and the arson attacks and the bombings and the throwing axes at politicians and attacking politicians with horsewhips and all that sort of thing, because that wouldn't set a good lesson.
Right.
You know, what they should do is write to their elected representative.
That's right. And remember that, permitted marches will just succeed in getting us everything, along with voting and writing your elected representative.
Yeah, even though, of course, women didn't have elected representatives at that point.
Yeah, right. They couldn't vote. So, but I remember people talking about that idea of in high school when I would mention something going on in some other country where things needed to change, and they said, well, they should just vote that person out of power. Like they just thought that's the way it worked everywhere. And if you couldn't do that, then, it must be not, this is the only possible solution. John, when you're trying to tell stories in a way that works, do you find that the best way to do it is to just get to something on a sort of individual or small group kind of human level? Because like when we're talking about something like the Haitian Revolution, like 1/3 of the population of Haiti died in the course of the revolution. Every building in the whole island was destroyed. It was, to try to get any kind of a handle on the level of death and destruction and torture and horror would be really just about impossible. But you can tell an individual story from that, and maybe that is more effective. Is that your experience?
Well, I think that in general, where we can, well, you know what, our content is all a mixture of individual stories and bigger stories. I think stories of masses, and I think in general terms, we think that stories of masses are kind of more important, because you know, what the media or schools and things try and do, or Hollywood when it does with any story is, partly for and with Hollywood and stuff, you could say it's large part for storytelling purposes. Like, you can't tell a story of you can't have a movie about, say, the miners' strike in Britain with 230,000 main characters. So you have to like pick a couple. But things like, when the media talk about, again, if we take the example of the miners' strike in Britain in 1984-5, that was a huge story with over 200,000 miners taking part, but the press portrayed it as Arthur Scargill, who was the union leader against Margaret Thatcher, who was the Conservative Prime Minister. So I think, if you want to call them like bourgeois or capitalist, right-wing commentators like to talk about things like that, because ultimately, and schools, whatever, teach that because ultimately they're beholden to the great men of history. And it is usually men, Margaret Thatcher being an exception. The narrative of great men shaping history, and obviously that's not what we think drives history. I think there's plenty of historical evidence of that being the case. So, but but kind of abstract stories about 10,000 people did this and blah blah blah. That they're not as engaging. So yeah, we do try and highlight stories of individual stories of ordinary people who've lived through some kind of extraordinary events. So yeah, there's a real kind of balance. But what we don't try and do a lot of the time is identify, say, this person led this and what have you, because almost any kind of struggle or story you think of, there are kind of some people that, for whatever reason, are more of a leader or organizer of a specific thing. Like, I guess, I've been involved in some disputes kind of at work where I've been the main person who was trying to organize something to get going with. But then other than that, if everyone else doesn't make a conscious decision to go along with you and to take part or whatever, then you're a leader of nothing, and then nothing happens. So it's not individual leaders that have made this happen. It's large numbers of people making a kind of conscious decision to do things together collectively. So it's hard to, and that is a harder kind of story to tell, but we think it is important to get that, to try and get that across. But yeah, it's a tricky line to tread, because also it's important to highlight the stories of little known people who've faced enormous odds, and so yeah. But I think to do that without overblowing the importance of individual people as opposed to nameless collectives.
Yeah. And lastly, John, I mean, you guys have really gotten a lot of support on Patreon, which is wonderful to see. In addition to getting lots of attention on platforms like Instagram, you're actually getting quite a bit of support. But if you got a whole bunch more support on Patreon, you got any particular plans for what to do next with this project?
Well, we are so grateful for the support of our patrons who really make possible everything that we do. With some more support, the first thing we would do with it is be able to make the podcast, release more regular podcast episodes. Beyond that, really, the kind of sky is the limit in terms of what we could work on. I mean, behind the scenes, one thing that we're really that we're working on is turning our archive of historical events into a kind of a large website with browsable timelines and maps and that sort of thing, which people will be able to like engage with on their smartphones, and to be able to kind of engage with the physical space around them, where where things have happened geographically, and in particular buildings and on particular streets and things like that. So that's something that we're really keen to keep working on. And but beyond that, if ever we started getting something like Chapo Trap House money or anything or anything like that, we'd be able to do explore other things, like especially media that are expensive, like video, because kind of any things like documentary is extremely powerful storytelling tools, but it's not something that we have the capacity to do at the moment. It's a kind of dream, wise, we could do things like that, like make documentaries about some of this stuff, and even sort of establish physical not right now, but when we can be in the same room and breathe when it's safe to breathe the same air with each other again, then kind of physical, potentially physical exhibitions. This is all kind of like dream stuff, essentially the more support that we have from wherever, the more different things that we'll be able to do, and the more people will be able to reach and hopefully inspire more. And obviously we want to do more book and print publishing as well, with our friends at PM Press.
Yeah, excellent. Wonderful. Well, it's been great talking to you, John. Thanks so much for joining me for the hour here.
Yeah, no, great chat, and thanks very much for having us. And
yeah, pleasure. I'll talk to you soon.
Cheers. Talk to you soon. Bye.
And thanks, everybody, for tuning into this episode of Discussions with David with John Lasdun of Working Class History. Check out workingclasshistory.com. Support them on Patreon. Follow them on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. And you can find this interview archived at if you look for the podcast This Week with David Rovics, wherever you get your podcasts, or go to davidrovics.com/thisweek, or get the David Rovics mobile app, or go to youtube.com/drovics and look for the Discussions with David playlist. Okay. Remember, mutual aid will get us through. Trust your neighbors. Don't pay the rent unless you really have to. Bye for now.